Hello, my name is Trudie Clark and I'm a Lead Tissue Viability Nurse in the Cancer Centre in Wales in the United Kingdom. My colleague Gary Bain has asked me to share with you the stories that I tell to patients and where I use analogies to explain things to patients. So mine relates to wound healing. So if we just think back to wound healing in general and we just recap on that, the first stage of wound healing is inflammation, when we get an increase in blood flow to the area. The second stage then is destruction. And in the destructive phase, the white blood cells that have left the blood supply and travelled to the wound bed, the neutrophils and the macrophages, they start then to phagocytose dead tissue, bacteria and viruses. So they're cleaning the wound bed up. After the wound bed has been cleaned up, you normally have a cavity of some degree, and here we have to fill that cavity with new tissue. So this is when we get granulation tissue formed. And what happens in this situation is the macrophages that are in the wound bed, they release growth factors, and the growth factors are proteins that orchestrate the wound process, the healing process. And these proteins that have been released by the macrophages work on a cell called the fibroblast. And the fibroblast cell produces collagen, and it comes out in strands. And these strands then bind together to make a matrix. And you get layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of this matrix filling the wound bed. You can't see it with the naked eye, but it's happening. But then this new tissue also needs a good blood supply. So angiogenic factors are released again by the macrophage that stimulate the blood vessels around the wound to send new blood vessels in to keep this tissue well oxygenated and alive. And these blood vessels grow in between the mesh. So when you look into the wound bed, you see these little red dots, and these are the tips of the blood vessels growing into the granulation tissue. And then what happens when it's fully vascularized, it just looks red and bobbly and bumpy, and that's your granulation tissue. And that will grow up from the base until it reaches the level of the surrounding skin. And this is where my analogy comes in. In the UK and in different parts of the world, there's a myth associated with wound healing. And when a wound gets to this stage, when it's nearly healed, people will say, let the air get to it and it'll dry out and you'll have a scab and it'll heal quicker. Well, in fact, that's a complete and utter myth. And this myth was dispelled by a gentleman called George Winter in the 60s. And he did some very, very early research in wound care onto pigs. And the pigs, he made the pigs their own control. So he made wounds on the back of pigs. And on one side of the back of pigs were these superficial wounds. So we'd only just lost the epidermis. We hadn't lost anything else. He left to the air and they scabbed over. On the other side of the pigs' backs, he covered them in a very early semi-permeable film dressing. So these never dried out. And because they never dried out, the epithelial cells to cover that gap were able to move quicker when they were covered in this film because the environment was moist. So the analogy I give to patients, as you can see it behind me here on the screen, I say to them, if they have a scab forming, it's like having to go under a subway, because those cells at the edge of the wound that need to cover it will never cover a scab. So they have to go down under the scab to meet the granulation tissue, and then they meet in the middle. But if you don't go under the subway and you keep the wound bed moist, it's just like someone walking across the road. And as you can see, it's quicker to walk across the road than to go down under the subway. So that's how I explain to patients that it's better for them to keep their wounds moist and not let the air get to it and not let a scab form. So I use the analogy of crossing the road is quicker than going under the subway. I hope that helps you when you're educating colleagues and patients. And thank you to Gary for asking me to share this knowledge with you.